this emphasis that I experienced growing up in American state schooling on self-expression as a kind of key tenet of contemporary pedagogy can be really misleading and really damaging. And I think it has been very misleading and really damaging. If you don't have the sense that a school has to do a few things, has to form the mind of its pupils, has to form the character of its pupils, and it also has to transmit a certain kind of culture.
This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation. Welcome all of you, the viewers of Common Sense Generation. Today we talk about modern education, and with me is Brian Lapsa, the Director of UK and European Operation for Memoria Press. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Brian, you studied classical languages, so classics, at Oxford.
That's right, yes.
So you're fluent in Latin.
Well, yes, I studied Latin, studied Greek, and fluency with ancient languages is a little bit hard to qualify, but I have a certain amount of written and spoken facility with it. But mostly we learn these languages so as to read the ancient text.
The ancient text, of course. So what sort of perspective it gives you, what it gave you to your education than like an ordinary person doesn't have?
Well, I suppose I could compare it to myself in that I was the ordinary person without that sort of education, and it was a little bit out of stubbornness when I discovered this classical tradition of learning that I shifted a bit from doing philosophy more or less without those ancient languages to try to devote some more time to them. And I suppose there's a lot we could say depending on how much you want to hear about Latin, but one of the things that is maybe most difficult to articulate but most precious when you experience it is the sense of being almost alongside the author who wrote these texts maybe 2,000 years ago or more, with the original expressions, with the original words, the original cadence of the prose even, and feeling that you're really sharing some kind of view with the author. Not even necessarily that you agree with all the views, but you're at least understanding someone from so long ago, from such a different culture, and a culture that really shaped ours. So it's a little bit like following a river upstream and finding your way to the source. And that's an image that was used throughout the history of Western civilization as well, to go back ad fontes, to the sources.
Amazing, especially that the roots of most of the European languages are in Latin. So we hear those words somewhere, they can ring a bell, at least at some level, especially in Italian and Spanish, but in English as well, in German. And then we realize that how much the life of those people shaped our life, and their image of the world shaped our life, and this is embedded in the language.
That's right. Yeah, there are a few different language groups in Europe, and there are some that you could say are directly descended from Latin, everything from Portuguese all the way through to Romanian, and French, Spanish, Italian that you mentioned in between. And a funny little...
It's the Roman languages, is it?
Yes, the Romance languages. But then beyond the borders of the old empire, such was the influence of the Roman legacy that Latin was kind of the official language in courts well beyond anywhere that the Roman Empire ever reached in the hundreds of years that followed the decline of the West. English is a really interesting case because it's a Germanic language at its origin, but then due to the Norman invasion in the year 1066, there was a massive influx of Latinate words that came along with the armies of the Normans, the Northern French. And slowly, the proportion of words in English that were due to Latin grew from something negligible in the Germanic period up to, depending on your field, and depending on the kind of conversation that you're having, 50% to 70%.
That's a lot. I think it's the funny say, it's like German and French and 1,000 years on an island, and that gives you English.
There you go. Yeah.
But yeah, it's shocking as when you see French and then you know English, that a lot of those words are the same, just the pronunciation is different. And of course, everything comes from Latin. which is also shows us their perspective and that there were the ancestors who were using this, and that our civilization started somewhere there. Tell us about if you can, as a philologist, also about modern Italian. So in this case, like what happened to Latin that it shifted and transformed to those different languages, such as Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese?
It's a great question. I'm not a specialist in the development of the Romance languages from Latin, but one thing that's very striking, especially in contrast to a country like, or language like Polish, which has retained so many cases, in at least the Western Romance languages, there's a contraction of cases and pretty much disappearance, as in nouns anyways. Pronouns still have some cases. But part of this suggests that there's, as we know historically as well, something of a decline of literacy for a few hundred years, and that means people aren't looking at the words, and they're judging based on what they understand orally. And so this means that endings often get lopped off and shortened, so case endings for your nominative, your genitive, accusative, dative, ablative, these sorts of things.
Of course, I mean the Polish, but German as well. Polish more 7 cases, German 5 cases. Everything what the child needs to learn.
Well, right, and Latin has all that in spades. Not as many for most words as Polish with 7, but if you get a lot of people continuing to speak a language, not in touch with the literary culture, not being trained to learn the cases, for instance, and to pronounce them very distinctly, then you have less attention given at all, and eventually the cases just converge, and you have one noun that's left. And some of this started already in the way during the period of the Roman Empire. If a word ends with a vowel and then an M, there's a kind of nasalization which gets pronounced something like an ol, which becomes simply a or o, depending on your modern Italian word, just to take the Italian example. So there are these slow shifts that happen through centuries of the non-literary existence of a language that produce these kinds of changes.
So it's only spoken, and then you don't have a standardized one through all over, but people who use it as a local language.
That's right. Yeah, it actually takes some time before you get a standard form of modern French or modern Italian, and modern Spanish. Indeed, and you continue to see stark regionalisms. Absolutely,
I think it goes even right now to the 20th century, even longer. But the creation of public TV was one of something which, even in Slavic languages, eventually turned them to sort of standard language all over the countries. But still, with some regional, you can hear it. Either people from the mountains always have different dialects, and very often people at the sea as well. So, which left some of those regional versions of word.
And to be clear, I like it. I think it's very, very charming. I think there's growing up in the United States and being in a family that moved around a lot, we have had, at least, I've been abroad for a while, so my English is a bit strange, but we had we used to joke about it as CNN English. So there's the standard cookie cutter form of English that everyone pronounces, and you can get it on the news, and it's just one form. But I think it's a little bit of a loss because there's such delightful regional variety in the way English is spoken around the United States still to this day, but diminishingly so.
Have you noticed the fact that right now even popular series are trying to embrace different dialects in English, which of course is a completely different story, at least different pronunciations. But because English is spoken by so many people in the world with so much different dialects and different pronunciations, that I think this is even harder to standardize. But have you noticed that popular series, even on Netflix, or they start to embrace those that people have an accent, different accents, and it is already there in public TV, or popular TV.
Here I have to confess that I don't follow a lot of that world very closely, so I wouldn't know where to start with that. But I have heard some things in living in Britain for some time, whereas the let's say the BBC English in the 1950s, 60s would be very formal, the so-called received pronunciation. There has been some push to use newscasters from different regions around England, England is fascinating, much smaller than the United States, for instance, but in some ways even starker regional dialects historically. And when you expand to the whole island of Britain, then all the more so. And there's been some push to have let's say the non-classical pronunciation of British being present in public life.
Exactly, that's what I mean. Language is, of course, a basis of all forms of education. And it was previously a classic education was based on learning classical languages, so Latin and Greek. I think most of that, even at the philosophy faculties, for many generations, it was obligatory to learn both, at least touch them. I think it's changed at the beginning of the 21st century, at least at the European universities, that it stopped being obligatory, it started to be voluntary if you want to pick up a Greek or Latin. But still, learning some words, of course, is important. But how this shift changed the education? And what is your viewpoint on the education?
Great question and a big question. And I'm glad you mentioned the context in Europe. I'll start with America, because I like to say that we destroyed our educational patrimony faster and more thoroughly than Europe, but that Europe sadly is catching up. And part of that is due to an emphasis on a sort of elusive notion of practicality, that what's needed in education is something related to skills and job training that will suit graduates for the current market. And that will obviously bias a school against including things like Latin or Greek in the curriculum. It's not like it was 1,000 years ago, or even really in some parts of the world 200 years ago, 250 to 200 years ago, where if you really wanted to advance somewhere in professional life, you needed to have Latin and probably some Greek as well. And of course, 1,000 years ago, if you wanted to read something, chances are it was going to have to be in Latin. We live in a very different world. But that's not to say that Latin and Greek aren't important. It's not even to say that they're not practical. I think they're eminently practical. It's maybe a hard sell, but I'll try to do it. And maybe there are a couple of different headings here. One is on the university side, and one on the school side. And I'll just touch on the university and then head to the schools. Universities, in particular the European universities, not only expected, let's say, philosophy students to study Greek and Latin, but even before being admitted, to have attained a very high level of proficiency in Latin and in Greek, both in reading and in writing. And to give an example, I believe it was the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, in the 1960s or 70s, an admissions exam could be something along the following lines. The student would come in, sit down, or the applicant would come in, sit down. The proctor would hand a clipping from that day's newspaper, slide it across the table and say, please render this into Thucydides in Greek. So not just any form of ancient Greek, but the ancient form of ancient Greek peculiar to one author. And when that had been done, the next exercise might be, okay, now turn it into the sort of Greek that the author Herodotus would write. And apparently there were enough people who could do that some were admitted, but also some were turned away. And this is an expectation that is very shocking to someone like me.
Absolutely, it's shocking for modern scholars who very often, the faculties even of philosophy, of course, we use some words, Greek words, which are you cannot avoid them, such as arche or logos.
Yeah, it's going to be a big one, yeah.
Of course, paideia and all of those who are necessary when you read Plato or Aristotle. But we don't read them in original versions unless you specialize in the classics ones. Yeah. Though I remember a lecture at the Freie University in Berlin when I studied, where it was pretty crazy. A professor who was making a lecture on Aristotle, bringing Aristotle in Greek, reading it out loud with her version of pronunciation, then translating it to German by herself during the lecture. And I tell you, this was ignatum per ignatum. So we're looking at her and wondering if she's crazy or not. So, I mean, tell me your case. Why do you think it's still important to learn those languages?
Well, some of it we already touched on a little bit. So if we look at the 50 to 70%, depending on how you do the estimate, of English vocabulary that's drawn directly or indirectly from Latin, you can look at this in a few ways. One, you can just memorize each individual word in English and the meaning, but you might have a dozen words or more that come from a single Latin root. So if you have something like lego, which is to read or to gather, you'll have select, elect, lecture, lesson. All these words will come from this one stem. And if you have a sense of what that one original word means, you can find your way through the English world as well. So paradoxically, Latin is a key to English. This may be a little bit less relevant to the Polish language, of course, but on the other hand, we do live in a world which is dominated by the English language. And I would imagine that for Poles who have a background in Latin, learning English could be much easier. So that's one, let's say, practical benefit. Another benefit for speakers of most Western European languages, Central Europe and Eastern Europe are a bit different because they've retained more of the cases. But learning a deeply inflected language, by which I mean a language that has a lot of cases for its nouns and it has very different personal endings and numerical endings for verbs, enforces a kind of analytical thinking that's in some ways analogous in the humanities to the benefits that a rigorous maths education gives on the maths and science side. So being trained to spot grammatical relations based on morphological endings, or morphological differences in the forms of words as they appear in writing, trains a sort of eye for not only Latin grammar, but then also the grammar of modern languages. If you can recognize what a subject is and a direct object is in Latin, then when you return to English or French or most German words, which don't show strong case variation, you have a more vivid sense of what it means to be playing those sorts of roles in the sentence. So that's all on the kind of practical side, I'd say. But then there's also the ability to appreciate the culture that we've inherited and that's spread throughout the world by now. I mean, Greece and Rome were so culturally successful that there really isn't a country in the world left anymore that's been untouched by their influence. Everywhere will call itself a republic in some way. There will be a Congress. There's probably a president or prime minister. All of the words I've just said are Latin.
Maybe in China.
But even they would call themselves the People's Republic, right? So at least in the words.
Yeah, in the words.
Yeah.
Agreed.
And remember, Marx, unfortunately, was a bit of a classicist. He had that classical education himself and worked on ancient materialism for the most part. But that too is, in some sense, an offshoot, an unfortunate offshoot, but an offshoot of the classical tradition.
Well, agreed. You're right. But I'm not sure if Marxists actually remember about it. But a lot of, I mean, on the other hand, most of them don't actually read Marx. So this is one. But talking, of course, all those practical elements, but how does it shape our education? How do you see this as a key to be an educated person in this way? That where does it lead us open, and we're taking it away because, let's say openly right now at the universities, the Latin or Greek are not more obligatory. Previously they were obligatory at the first year. You would need just to at least have a scratch, maybe not be fluent, of course, but at least understand something. But right now, if you ask even a university student, what's the language of the New Testament? How many of them will actually tell you that it's a koine? Not many. But still it's going on. So it seems like we can live without it. So how will you make a contrary to this state?
Sure. Well, you can live without a lot of things, without which life would nonetheless be somehow diminished and impoverished. when I make the case for the necessity of Latin, I always say it's okay. What is it not necessary for? I'm not going to argue that it's necessary for salvation, for instance. It's not necessary to be a good person. It's not even necessary to be a decent person. You can be a very decent person without Latin. Perhaps that's lamentable, but it's true. And on the other hand, it's not sufficient to be a decent person. We all have, the haunting memory of some of these very well-educated Germans in the Second World War who had the classical education or something like it, and nonetheless committed these atrocities. So the Nazi Latinist is something that we have to bear in mind as well as a possibility. And it's good to avoid utopian thinking with anything, educationally as well.
But the language, of course, shapes our way of thinking.
It shapes our way of thinking. Part of that has to do with the sort of analytical structures that I mentioned, but part of it also has to do with being able to access the cultural patrimony of the West, and that's in pretty much any sphere. I mean, look to law, look to government, look to theology, look to literature, and I mean both prose literature as well as poetry, the sciences, medicine, biology. Any of these fields is going to be dominated in terms of its technical vocabulary by Latin as well as by Greek. But still Latin, if it's Greek, it's Latinized Greek. So a good and, a painful example of the importance of continued Latin study came in the last few years from one of the current members of the Supreme Court, the American Supreme Court. And there was some case which came up and was being discussed, and she confused de facto and de jure. And de facto is as things really are, as the facts are, and de jure is what the law says, glossing it generally. Yeah, that's okay. Most people who don't know Latin know that. Okay, and she confused these, conflated them, and said, well, de facto, this is what should be happening because that's what's in the law, but what's really happening de jure is such and such. And her colleague on the Supreme Court turned to her and said, oh, you mean the other way around. De facto is what's really happening, and de jure is what the law says. And she doubled down and she said, no, I know what I said, de facto, and she repeated her error. And I think he even gave her another chance to correct herself. Instead, she made an embarrassment of herself, of the United States Supreme Court, of the whole country. As I say, it's a difficult error to make even if you don't know Latin, especially if you're a lawyer. But if you do know Latin, it's impossible to make this mistake when you're given the chance to correct yourself. Okay.
Yeah, even just giving you this example of de facto and de jure, it's a good one that we use it so often in just modern languages, everyday life, saying, oh, de facto something, da 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 da. And we don't realize it's come from Latin. But and the other things are a lot of expressions which in fact come from a lot of Latin cases, law cases, or the history of Rome, which we do use every day, and we just don't know their origins. I think it's the biggest source of metaphors which shape our life, of course, and our way of thinking, except maybe the Bible. The Bible is the second one, which of course from New Testament than the Greek version of it. But what I want to say that when we realize this in language, and this very rarely if you're not a philologist, then you realize that you actually don't speak. You don't speak your own language. You use phrases and everything which was used before. You're not anyhow creating anything here, unless you're really amazing. But you basically are using the words of previous generations, the expressions of previous generations. So all the time, even in the case of language, again, we are standing on the shoulders of the giants, and it is nice when we at least realize those shoulders.
Absolutely. Yeah. No. You point to something that's really important, also to return to our previous question about education and where things went wrong in a sense. This emphasis that I experienced growing up in American state schooling on self-expression as a kind of key tenet of contemporary pedagogy can be really misleading and really damaging. And I think it has been very misleading and really damaging. If you don't have the sense that a school has to do a few things, has to form the mind of its pupils, has to form the character of its pupils, and it also has to transmit a certain kind of culture. If you don't have that in place and instead say to an 8-year-old, it's time to self-express and art is going to be whatever you want it to be. Well, it's nice and cute to have a scribbled picture at some point, but at a further point, you kind of want to be able to draw. It's a really good thing to be able to draw nicely. I can't, but I really admire people who can, who had that sort of training. Music and sports are great examples of fields that haven't totally collapsed in terms of their pedagogy. You practice when you're a kid. If you want to become a great musician or a great athlete someday, you practice basic maneuvers and exercises over and over and over and over again, whatever your sport is, whatever your music is. And we somehow jettisoned this from, again, the American sphere, maybe not quite as disastrous in Poland. But we've jettisoned things like memorization, repetition, recitation, exercises in all the disciplines. And what we've seen in America in the last 20, 30 years now is people really getting frustrated with this. They don't want to send their children to schools where they're going to come home and just be told or just report that they've only more or less self-expressed all day or write
or the day, all day.
All day, or that's on the one hand, and then on the other hand is having their heads filled with all sorts of disastrous ideologies. So that's a kind of pedagogical reason for dissent from the still prevalent contemporary educational model, and it's really fueled this revival of classical education in America, and increasingly a return to recovery of classical education as it has existed all over Europe.
Tell us about this, the revival of this education. But is it what consisted of the classical education? And I think that's also, as you mentioned, learning something by heart. But that goes even beyond the Romans. It goes very deep into the paideia, the Greek paideia, of memorizing by heart all the classic texts, which actually were not texts at this point, but there were the stories, the epopeas told. But through this memorizing the Odyssey, you've learned not only the story of it or what they said, but of course what was the virtues which were presented by the characters there, and you see the pattern how they acted, and what was their how it shaped their life, and then the student, a young person, could understand this virtue.
You've stated it beautifully. That's the mimetic ethos that's at the heart of a classical education.
But Brian, I think we put a point here,
okay.
And we actually make this a small invitation for all the viewers of Common Sense Generation, actually to stay with us for another interview with Brian, where he will tell us more about the turn of the classic education in US right now. And I thank you very much for watching our show. And I also thank Polish National Foundation for making this video podcast possible. This is Common Sense Generation. Common Sense Generation.